Greetings and welcome there, academic proletariat, to this episode of the Fireside Chats with Mr. Olson, where we will talk about the revolution. Totally kidding. You look at that image on the screen right now and you think we're talking about the revolution, but we're not, and we are going to crush any myths you might have about this join or die poster today. So students, Mr. Bachhuber, buckle up, let's go, and let's hit Mercantilism Gone Wild. So the term for this event in America is called the French and Indian War, but worldwide it's called the 7 Years' War, even though it took 9 years, as we'll see why in a little bit. So you might have heard about this one before, the French and Indian War. It is like opening the floodgates toward a revolution, but we're not going to get there yet. As you will see, it's very important to keep that straight. We're going to get this started with some contextualization, and in order to do so, we have to review what mercantilism is. I know what you're thinking, especially if you are a person who was in AP World last year. You've been beaten over the head with mercantilism, so much so that you might feel like a beaver, which will make sense in a little bit. Anyways, we're going to review it again because it's that important. Mercantilism is an economic philosophy in which the mother country controls all aspects of trade in order to turn a profit. So the goal is to make more money than you spend, and to arrive at that goal, the mother country controls every single aspect, which means they tell you where stuff can go, they tell you what can go there, they tell you how much you got to pay in taxes when the stuff gets and goes where it's going. And they do this in order to make sure all the stuff flows through their colonies and their country instead of other ones. Because if I'm British and I'm getting stuff from my British colonies, I don't want them to go to France. I want them to come through Britain first so I can tax them and then send them off to France at a higher price. Okay, so how does mercantilism work? Well, in order to have a good mercantilist system, you need to have three things. 1, colonies. 2, raw materials that you get from those colonies. And 3, workers that extract the raw materials. Now, most of the time, this is done by utilizing the landscape to grow some sort of thing that sells for a lot of money elsewhere. You know, we're talking a lot about cash crops, and we're talking about other materials that can be easily grown and or made in the colonies. We're not talking a lot about manufactured goods. That's mostly done in Britain. So if I were to look at a map of this system, I would, of course, get this beautiful mercantilist triangular trade system set up by the British in the mid-1700s. Okay, so you've got this system in which manufactured goods come from Europe. They go down to the west coast of Africa. And then, of course, some manufactured goods go over to the New World, either directly or from Africa. But mostly from Africa, you're seeing enslaved people move to the Indies, or in some cases to North America itself. But most of those enslaved people don't go to North America. They end up in the Indies first. Then most of them are sent north into the British colonies in North America, because you don't need as many enslaved people here as you do down here, because sugarcane takes more enslaved people than does the cotton that was being grown at this time. Not a lot of cotton, though. Remember, you're not supposed to say that yet. Okay, fine. So we've got this system in which Britain is constantly in contact with and cooperation with its colonial regions. This then is going to lead to the colonial regions developing their own economies. They're going to grow unique things so as to turn the maximum amount of profit for Britain. Now, in the last period, we talked about how these colonial regions had somewhat autonomous existences, but after things like Bacon's Rebellion and the Salem Witch Trials and King Philip's War and Stonewall Rebellion, all of that independence and autonomy gets clamped down, and Britain just wants these colonies to make money. Okay, so in order to make sure that they're doing that, they start to pass a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts. These Navigation Acts tell the colonies where and what they can send, to whom and where they can send it. So mostly they're trying to root out any sort of smuggling and any sort of illegal trade with other colonial regions, namely that of France. Okay, now remember that mercantilism is a step in the process between feudalism and capitalism. So in feudalism, everything was small-scale, local in terms of controlling the economy. Capitalism is when individuals own the means of production and the government kind of takes a step back. Mercantilism is like government involvement, but not to enrich and or to take care of the people. This is government oversight to increase the coffers of the leaders, the kings, the rulers of this area, okay? Now, if you're a mercantilist, and you're the king of a nation that has this mercantilist system in place, the worst thing for you is smuggling, because if people are out there smuggling and they're going around your rules and around your expectations, and they are cutting tax revenue, which is where you make most of your money. So the worst possible thing for this system is if smugglers come and undermine you. The second worst thing is, of course, other people showing up. Now, several European kingdoms at this time wanted mercantilist systems because they wanted to make money, which means they were out there trying to find colonies. This is the map that we were looking at toward the end of the last historical period, and this is how we start off this one, period 3, that begins in 1754. You'll note that in a situation like this, where there are several European countries with claims to land in one continental area, usually that's a recipe for disaster. So here, over here, stuff's about to hit the fan, and we're going to see why. Now, if we're going to explain how war breaks out between colonial powers here in North America, we have to explain a little bit more about this place, New France, that we sort of left hanging last time. You'll note here by this very, very clear and well-pixelated map that the French initially make their inroads in North America via the St. Lawrence River and come down through the Great Lakes and will eventually make their way into the Mississippi River Valley. Now, at first, the French explorer Cartier misses this entrance, and so he does not get down into the inner part of North America. It takes Samuel de Champlain later in the early 1600s to get there. But get there they do, and eventually they make their way all the way down the Mississippi River, which is why there are so many Frenchy names in states like Illinois. Look at them. Joliet, LaSalle, Peru, you have St. Louis, you have Moline, all these places with Frenchy names because the French were here first in terms of European powers. Now, why were the French here? Well, of course, they were looking for some sort of vital commodity that could pad their wallets and add to their coffers, and that commodity was, of course, beaver fur. Now, fur was especially useful at this time because we're still stuck in this environmental period known as the Little Ice Age, and people in Europe were cold, and therefore they wanted stuff to wear to warm them up. Hats, jackets, and whatnot. And beaver pelts were the ticket. They were the number one thing through the 16 and 1700s that kept Europeans warm. Now, what the French did is they went into the interlands in North America and started to look for beavers. They were so in tune with this beaver hunting that they charted out and made detailed images of how the Native Americans had perfected this beaver trapping technique, and they even publicized and published pamphlets like this one. You can see that there's a beaver pool, and there are several people working here to try and trap and or get the beavers. Now, if you're going to hunt beaver, and this is a side note but kind of crazy, you can't shoot them and you can't nail them with arrows because then that ruins the pelt, which means that you have to bludgeon them to death. So oftentimes what the French and their Native American allies did was go to a beaver dam, break it open from the top, get the beavers out scurrying, and then bludgeon them to death with a club, usually made out of whale bone. Well, that's a nice image, which I'm sure all the beaver fans out there are really happy about. Anyways, this was not only required a close relationship between the Native Americans and the French, but also it left less of an environmental impact. Now, it doesn't leave no environmental impact because beavers were almost hunted to extinction, and beavers do some vital things for an ecosystem, like dam up a river so that it floods and fertilizes the area around it. Now, it's ironic how this worked because when the beaver dams were destroyed and the pools behind them were drained, it all of a sudden left a nice fertile area for people to come along and plant things in the meadow that now existed where the beaver pool once was. Nevertheless, things like this work in weird ways. The environment was affected, but not as much as plantation agriculture. So we have the French in the forests trapping and killing beavers, using the Native American allies to help them. And we get a situation where the Native Americans and the French develop a somewhat good relationship. Now, when the Society of Jesus or the Jesuits show up, that starts to go south a little bit because they start to forced conversions upon the Native Americans, and the Native Americans aren't too happy about it. So the relationship does sort of fall off over time, something that will become incredibly important in a second. But nevertheless, the French in the Mississippi River Valley to hunt beaver. Awesome. So now we have a colonial situation like this. Now, I asked you before, when you get two European countries that are signified by different colors, like the French here in this pinky color and the British here in this periwinkle color, when you get them so close in a land space, what's bound to happen? Fighting, you said. Fantastic. So we've got a tenuous situation. Now, it's interesting how this works out, because you can see that the Appalachian Mountains run through this area, and any place on a map where the two colors are like lined, well, that's a recipe for disaster. And the disaster is exactly what happens. So as Britain's colonial population is expanding, they start to move further and further west. They start to then claim land in the Ohio Valley, which is also claimed by the French, and we've got ourselves a problem. So when George Washington, yes, that George Washington, as we'll see in a second, goes out to stake claim to some land, he meets some hostile French counterparts, and you get, well, a situation. All right, now the Native Americans, who had been coexisting with the French for a while, see this as, a threat, and therefore they turn to the French and they say, can you help us? And the French, obviously, who also claim title to the land, see this as a threat as well, especially considering the fact that, they go way back with the British. Okay, to tell you more about the origins of and the outcome of the 7 Years' War, we bring back our old friend Crash Course. When you watch this, just note some things that are important information, causes, effects of the 7 Years' War, and we'll talk about them afterwards. Here goes.
No! Let's go to the thought bubble. The actual fighting began when the British, or more precisely British colonists, led by a 21-year-old militia colonel named George Washington, yes, that George Washington, tried to eject the French from the forts they were constructing in western Pennsylvania. The first attempt in 1754 was a disaster. Washington built and then abandoned the ironically named Fort Necessity, with the loss of 1/3 of his men. It was followed by the equally unsuccessful attack on Fort Duquesne, now located in downtown Pittsburgh, where the French and Indians pounded the British, killing 2/3 of General Braddock's forces and also General Braddock. Things didn't go much better for the British for the next 2 years, although they did take control of part of Nova Scotia and kick out more than 11,000 French Acadians, many of whom died in what is called the expulsion. Some of those who didn't ended up in Louisiana and became Cajuns. But anyway, the tide began to turn for the British in 1759 when they captured French forts Duquesne, finally, Ticonderoga, and Louisburg. The biggest victory of all came in September, when the British trounced the French at the Plains of Abraham near Quebec. Montreal surrendered the next year. The rest of the battles aren't that important unless you were fighting in them, and I'm sure you can count on the French and Indian War aficionados to fill the gaps in comments, but suffice it to say that the British were victorious in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and as far away as India. The war continued officially for 3 more years and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Thanks.
Okay, so tell a friend what you learned about the 7 Years' War. Pause me for a second. Bring me back after you've had a minute to talk. Go. Okay, hopefully you've had a minute to talk with somebody who learned something about the 7 Years' War, maybe the same thing as you, maybe something different, but lo and behold, you should have gathered most above all else that the French were winning at the beginning, and then the tables turned in the middle, and the British ended up being victorious in this war. Okay, now the fighting took place not only in North America, but South America and in India, so it does get dubbed the First World War, but we're not going to go into that right now. We want to talk more about specifics about what's going on between 1754 and 1763 in the North American mainland. Okay, so I said that this Ohio company led by George Washington goes out to stake some land claims, and they start to fight with the French in the Ohio Valley, and that's what sets off the war here. Okay, now the British have several advantages in this war. First of all, they have access to the eastern seaboard, which means it's easier for them to get from their colonies to their British Isles, and that allows them better contact and better supplies. The French are stuck in the middle of the continent, so they don't really have the benefit of location. Additionally, there are many more British people in the colonies. The population is way higher for Britain, and therefore they have more people that can be used in a battle. Now, the French have their own advantages, like, for instance, the fact that they are more united. The British colonies hate each other. We've been talking about them as being different for a long time. Only the Great Awakening is something that has brought them together. And so the French don't have to overcome that rivalry between colonies. Additionally, the French have a much better relationship with the Native Americans, which will come in handy, especially if they're going to fight the British, because, well, most of these Native American tribes hate the British. Okay, now I just said that the British colonies are not getting along with one another. That's what leads Benjamin Franklin to draw what many consider the first influential political cartoon in American history, this Albany Plan of Union cartoon drawn up in 1754. Now, look at this image and promise me you will never, ever associate it directly with the American Revolution, because it's not. This is for the French and Indian War. We can't make that mistake. It's been on a test before, and it has caused people some trip-ups. So I don't want to see it get in the way. The point of this cartoon is obviously that you join together or you die. Die at the hands of the British? No, because in 1754, the colonists were British. Join together or die at the hands of the French. Okay, so how does the British actually get it together? Well, in the middle of the war, 1757, they get a new prime minister, William Pitt, who institutes 3 major changes that allow them to start winning. First of all, he replaces some generals in the battlefield and increases the amount of supplies. Okay, that's easy. The next 2 are important. Next, he neutralizes the Native Americans by getting them to sign the Treaty of Easton. In this war, Native Americans fought on both sides, but the lion's share of Native American tribes, with the exception of the Iroquois, fought on the side of the French. And if they were fighting with the French, that means that they were the British enemy. Now, if the British could neutralize them or get them to stop fighting, then all of a sudden the British would be in better shape. So they get the Native Americans to sign this Treaty of Easton in 1758, and many of the Native Americans now are neutral and don't fight anymore. This decreases the amount of enemies that are out there for the British. The second thing that William Pitt does is he institutes a policy of deficit spending. This is where the British crown spends itself into debt in hopes of winning the war. So more supplies, more people, more boats, more guns, more everything. Yeah, you're going to have to spend yourself into deficit, but if you win, you'll be able to make all that money back, and you'll be able to pay it back when you're finished. Eventually, it pays off. By 1760, the fighting is mostly done, and by 1762, the French have surrendered in North America. The fighting continues for another year, and by 1763, it's all over. Now, in that crash course clip, John Green mentioned Fort Duquesne, which is now called Fort Pitt. Why? Because William Pitt was the guy who is credited with turning around the trajectory of the war. So you can go there and you can visit, as I did, and took some awesome pictures. So check this out. There's a bust of William Pitt when you walk in, and it says, "I have used the freedom of giving your name to Fort Duquesne, as I hope it was in some measure the being actuated by your spirits that now makes us masters of this place." Pitt is credited with having won this big plot of land or control of the Ohio Valley. Now, as you continue into the museum, you get to this display. You'll see it's in Native American, and the inscription here is crucial in helping us understand just what was going on. It says, Native American chief who wrote a letter to a British soldier says that the French want to cheat us out of our country, but we will stop them, and brothers the English, you must help us. We expect that you will build a strong house on the river Ohio, that in case of war, we may have place to secure our wives and children, likewise our brothers that come to trade with us. This group of Native Americans fought against the French with the British. Just a nice reminder that Native Americans are autonomous groups that do not always side with one player in a fight. So here we've got a situation in which the Native Americans are fighting on both sides. Most of them fought with the French, which is why it's called the French and Indian War, but some did in fact side with the British. Now, if you continue into Fort Pitt, you can see that you can stand in these little carve-out head things. There's me and my wife as a British troop and British wife, I guess. Now, continue in, and you get to an outpost or a trading post within in or near Fort Pitt, and you can see the lion's share of the things in there are fur, because that was the lucrative commodity. I want you to stop and say to yourself, who was worse in this situation? Was it the French or was it the British? Ponder that for a moment, and we'll talk about it the next time that we revisit or that we're in each other's presence. Okay, now eventually this war ends and the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1763. Now we are going to measure this class by Treaty of Paris. There are 4, which means you are 25% done with this course. Congratulations. If ever looking for a treaty to talk about the end of a war and you don't know the specific name, I'd go with Paris. Why? Well, as you can see, that list only goes until 1920. There have been a few. Yes, that's right. Okay, so now what happens as a result of this Treaty of Paris? Well, Britain gains all of Canada, go Canada, and all the lands between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. Now, part of Canada does remain culturally and linguistically French, Quebec, but as they explained in the video, that one gets a little complicated when the British kick a lot of them out. But that's why New Orleans is a place that has a lot of French roots. Okay, I digress. Britain gains Florida because Spain had fought on the side of France. But France gets to keep its Sugar Islands, which really is helpful because the most lucrative colony in the world at the time was Haiti. So at least they didn't lose that one. Now, the British might seem to gain a lot from this, right? A lot of land, a lot more opportunities, but there's a lot of problems too. Remember that deficit spending? Well, they run themselves into a stupid amount of debt. Additionally, they have to follow through on their treaty with the Native Americans that said that they wouldn't fight them anymore, which means that now they have to pay for defense. They got to enforce that Treaty of Easton. So they're in debt, and they've got to pay more than they ever have before. You should stop and think to yourself, who is this treaty better for? France, who got to keep their Sugar Islands, or Britain, which was given a lot more land but got a lot of debt on top of it? Now, this has been a document on an actual AP test before, and you can see they really want you to focus in on the land claim transitions. Britain gets everything east of the Mississippi River, so now they don't have to worry about any French land claim disputes anymore, and they don't have to worry about Spain causing dissent in Florida. They get that. But France, you can see, still controls their side of Saint-Domingue. Okay, so now ultimately the British, despite their land claims and despite their increase for population growth, are left with some negative consequences. That debt we mentioned and the burden of having to defend. France loses territory in North America but keeps their Sugar Island. But who is this French and Indian War the worst for? Well, of course, it's the worst for the Native Americans, who instead of having the French there now have inherited the British, which is kind of terrible. And this is illustrated by the fact that shortly after the war is over, when British settlement is supposed to stop, it continues, and a loose confederation of Native American, led by Pontiac, who's an Ottawa Native American, unite together and rise up in simultaneous attacks in the Ohio Valley. Now, this, of course, catches the British by surprise because they think that they're on the Native Americans' good side, and of course the colonists respond with, more agitation, calling for lives, calling for blood. The British, though, the British Crown responds by telling the colonists, you've got to behave yourself because we do not want any more fighting. We're in too much debt. We've got too much to worry about. We want to be done. All right, so there you have it. And you should now be able to tell why that Join or Die cartoon is not the colonies entering their rep era. All right. Peace out.